Hi, I'm Shane, and this is a new informational show where we tap into the history of everything beer and what's new in our local beer scene. This is the Taproom. Let's start off this first episode with a few local things happening around Halifax. Firstly, everything is pretty much back up and running in Nova Scotia. Pubs, bars, and breweries are opening up to in-person visits and events happening everywhere. This is good news for a lot of local business and the sanity of the general public. With that being said, let's just make sure that we're following the rules of each establishment and the public health guidelines. The Pride Festival is upon us, and we're seeing local breweries coming out with Pride beers, just like this one from Garrison, the Queer Summer Brew. I had it was pretty good. I encourage everyone to go out and pick up a few cans from local breweries, and please stop buying Bud Light. It is not a good beer, and there are plenty of options from local breweries around here if you're into light beer. And for the last thing, Good Robot wants to make you rich. Okay, maybe not exactly, but they are coming up with this new campaign called Micro Influencer, where if you tag Good Robot on one of your Instagram photos or videos with one of their select cans, they will pay you $1 per post.
Here, $1.
That means that Good Robot beer is even cheaper. I'll leave links in the description below so you can check it out in greater detail. Now that the new stuff is out of the way, I want to get into the old stuff. Brewing our last beer got me thinking, where did it all start? I mean, it's a pretty complicated process. Did they just happen on it by accident? Was it trial and error or calculated before it even began? Nowadays, beer is the most popular alcoholic beverage and one of the most popular beverages outside of water, tea, and coffee. So how did beer get to where it is today? The answer you probably figured isn't so easy. We don't know where it started exactly, but it probably started with a barrel full of fruit that collected rainwater and naturally occurring yeast. This would have fermented into something that early farmers would have tasted and made them feel great, so they probably tried to replicate. The earliest evidence for fermented beverages came from the Yellow River Valley in China nearly 10,000 years ago. This would have been halfway through the Neolithic period, which was at the end of the Stone Age. This early alcohol brewed in China was a combination of fermented rice, honey, and fruit, not exactly the ingredients we consider when thinking of beer. There's also evidence a few thousand years later that the Egyptians were brewing alcohol from dates, pomegranates, and herbs. But this doesn't really sound like beer either. I mean, where are the malts and the hops? When we think of beer, these are the two main ingredients that come to mind. But what are they? First, let's start with malt. What is malt anyway? Malting is the process in which grains, usually barley, undergo germination or sprouting and then drying. This process develops enzymes within the grain that open up starch reserves that can later be converted into sugar. Okay, so we've got a pretty good idea on what malt is. So where did the brewing with malts begin? When talking about the infancy of beer and the fermentation of malted grains, we can't continue without talking about the Sumers in Mesopotamia, a large part of what's now called the Middle East. Tablets suggest that the majority of brewers in this time were actually women and very, very well respected within their communities as artisans. Within these Sumerian tablets, they spoke of Ninkasi, a tutelary goddess of beer. A hymn to Ninkasi is among the earliest human writing and is a poem effectively describing beer making. The poem is very long and vague in today's terms, so I'll spare you the trouble, but it does somewhat describe malting grains and brewing those ensuing malt. But I don't think that's good enough. When you look at an ingredient list on beer, it usually includes grains as well as hops. But the early fermented drinks that we spoke of, they don't include hops. But what are hops anyway? What is their purpose in beer? Hops are a flowering plant existing in the same family as cannabis.
Oh, gnarly!
It's used as a bittering, flavoring, and stability agent within the beer. But hops weren't always used in the flavoring of beer. That honor went to the herb mixture called gruit. Gruit was a combination of sweet gale, mugwort, yarrow, ground ivy, horehound, and Kaluna heather. It was eventually discovered that a flowering plant called hops provided a pleasant bitterness to the beer that Gruit just didn't have. Hops were easier to cultivate and helped preserve the beer for much longer. The first documented cultivation of hops was in 736 AD in Hallertau, Germany. But the first usage of hops within brewing beer didn't happen for another 300 years. But let's be honest, if Germany had hops for 300 years and wasn't putting it in their beer, who was? Well, nobody, because Gruit was mostly used all the way up to the 13th century, until hops started giving it a run for its money, particularly in Belgium and Holland. In Britain, Holland started importing hopped beer as early as the 14th century, but still wasn't as popular as the sweeter English brewed beer without hops. It wasn't until the end of the 15th century where the first hop plants were introduced to England from Belgium. These were grown mostly in the southeast county of Kent. So, wait, when did we start brewing beer? So, what we know about the history of it all, what we know as beer today didn't really start until the 13th century in Belgium and Holland. There were fermented malt beverages brewed far earlier than that, but without the addition of hops. You know, it would be interesting to see what ales would taste like without the addition of hops, or by using Gruit. Well, that's it for our first episode of the Taproom. I hope you learned something new about beer. Once again, I'll link to Good Robot's micro-influencer program in the description below, and remember to check out those new Pride beers. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.